We are in Daniel chapter 5 as we continue to make our way through the book of Daniel. This is our 5th week in our Daniel series. We will be in it this week, and then next week we will cover one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament for sure, the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And then we will have a 2-week break. Ashley and I will be out of town for a couple of weeks, and then we'll come back and finish the book of Daniel throughout the remainder of the summer. So I encourage you to be here. Bring a Bible. We're always going to seek to preach from the Bible. At City Church, I want you to hear from God's Word and let it be your kind of lead as opposed to me. We want the Word to be most prominent. And so if you do not own a Bible, we would love to give you one. And so just let us know that. We will be happy to gift you a Bible. So we probably have all heard the phrase, the handwriting is on the wall. That means that something bad is inevitable. It's going to happen. The handwriting is on the wall. And that common phrase, idiom, is taken from this story in Daniel chapter 5. Let me kind of bring us up to speed where we are as far as the context of Daniel chapter 5. Most Old Testament scholars believe we're now around the year 539 BC. Our story started in about 605-ish BC, so this is about 65 years after Daniel chapter 1, when Daniel and his friends and other young Hebrew males were taken captive, taken into exile. So this is about 65 years later, which puts Daniel around the age of 80. Nebuchadnezzar, this king who's been prominent through the first 4 chapters of the book of Daniel, is now dead. And what most believe is his grandson, Belshazzar, is now king. Now, and this is a tidbit, you can kind of go do your own research on this, but for years and years and years of time, skeptics of the Old Testament raised questions about the authenticity of the book of Daniel because of this character in the book, Belshazzar. There was no historical evidence that this guy existed in any way. And most of Nebuchadnezzar's sons that were found in archaeology, none of them had the name Belshazzar. And then within the last 75 to 100 years, there's been things discovered in archaeology that confirmed that Belshazzar was an actual king around this time frame. So you can chase all that down on your own for all of you that like to prove through archaeology things like that. But we know about Belshazzar is that he's definitely no Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror, he was a builder, he was wealthy, and Belshazzar is not that. Belshazzar is more the kind of partier of the grandson of the patriarch Nebuchadnezzar, and that's where we find ourselves when Daniel chapter 5 opens, with Belshazzar kind of throwing this kegger for his nobles. Verse 1, Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in front of the 1,000. This phrase drank wine means it was like ongoing drinking. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, he commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought. We talked about that in the very first week, how when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, he took these sacred vessels from the temple and brought them to the Babylonian kingdom. So that be brought that the kings and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Where do you file concubine on your tax forms? I haven't found that spot. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So again, Belshazzar throws this party for 1,000 of his nobles. And at some point, he brings in these sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple when the Babylonians captured Jerusalem. And he used them to toast his own false gods. Now, this is a very profane act of public blasphemy against Yahweh, against the God of Israel. And then as we read in the story, this is an unusual text, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way. And then our English translations are very generous here, and they kind of smooth this over for us. His knees knocked together. What the original Hebrew here basically means he wet his pants. He has lost control of his bodily functions, is the actual Hebrew phrase here. And let's just say, can we blame him, right? This mysterious severed hand appears in this great banquet hall in the middle of this party, and it begins to write on the wall. And this is not a Netflix movie. This is not like CPG. Like, this is an actual hand that appears, and Belshazzar freaks out. And we would probably be in a similar situation if we were in whatever context. A severed hand appears and begins to write on the wall. If you go on to read the story, his wise men are brought in, and they are once again unable to interpret the handwriting on the wall. At this point, this shouldn't be a big shocker to us that when God sends a message, the king's wise men are unable to interpret it. And so the king is left embarrassed, and he is very distressed. And then I like this kind of next part of the story. The mother queen shows up in verse 10. The queen. And again, most scholars believe this is probably either Nebuchadnezzar's wife, his widow. She shows up, the mother queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change." Important phrase here in verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. We've seen this phrase used about Daniel before by Nebuchadnezzar. The days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel. The king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show thee interpretation. So this queen, this mother queen figure shows up at the party. She wasn't present. She hears about what's going on. She shows up, and she's annoyed, right? She chides the incompetent king by saying, there's a man in the kingdom. Like Daniel had this reputation. There's a man in the kingdom in whom dwells the spirit of the holy gods. And his name is Daniel. Like, get him. Go get Daniel. And we don't know, is Daniel like retired at this point? I mean, he's like 80 plus years old. We do know he was, made a leader in the kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar, but maybe his time of retirement has happened. And we don't know if it's just a position change or he lives somewhere else in the kingdom. It is a big kingdom. And so Daniel, for whatever reason, is off out of the spotlight. But the queen says, go get Daniel. Go get him. He is the man. He is the one in whom the spirit of the gods dwell. He'll be able to interpret the dream. So 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. Now notice Belshazzar's attitude here. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought from Judah. Very condescending attitude here. Hey, you're one of those exiles. Like you're one of the ones taken captive. And again, this is 60 plus years later. Don't forget who you are, Daniel. You're not one of us. You're one of the exiles. And then there's this tone of skepticism in 14. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing, make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So again, there's this tone of skepticism by Belshazzar. I've heard. But Daniel, if you're able to pull this off, there's great reward for you. Give me the interpretation, and we're going to deck you out in royal clothes. We're going to throw some gold on you, and we're going to give you a appointed place. So there's going to be great reward for you. Daniel's response, 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself. Give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel says, hey, keep your rewards. I can't be bought. My God can't be bought, but I will give you the interpretation as God has given it to me. And then Daniel proceeds to remind the king, Belshazzar, how God humbled Nebuchadnezzar to demonstrate God's supreme authority and power over all kings, over all kingdoms of the earth. Now, there's worth a note here, Belshazzar should know about this incident. Now, there's no doubt that he knows about the story of Nebuchadnezzar that we covered last week in chapter 4, where God and Nebuchadnezzar kind of finally had this duel where God put Nebuchadnezzar in his place once and for all. And it seems by the end of chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar perhaps has even given his commitment, his loyalty, his life to the one true God. And so Belshazzar would know of this incident, but he did not learn from it. He did not follow the path of Nebuchadnezzar. And as a result, Daniel rebukes Belshazzar over his refusal to humble himself. He's blasphemed God publicly, and now he will face God's judgment. Verse 22, he says this, and you, his son Belshazzar, you've not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you, your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose all your ways you have not honored. So he rebukes the king. You have blasphemed. You've not learned from Nebuchadnezzar. If nothing, you have publicly blasphemed God. You've given your allegiance to gods who cannot see, who cannot hear, who cannot react, and you have ignored and rebelled against the God that holds your breath in his hands. And this handwriting on the wall is an announcement of the kings and the kingdoms pending downfall. Look in 24. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Tekel, and Parson. This is the interpretation of that matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So basically, the handwriting means, and these are all economic terms in the original language. But the translations here, the idea here, Mene, is that God has numbered the days of your kingdom. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to this other kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. Numbered, weighed, divided. Numbered, weighed, divided. And sure enough, that very night, verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, Chaldean king, was killed. And in 31, Darius, the king of the Medes and Persians, begins to rule and reign. That very night, Belshazzar was killed, and the Medes and the Persians took control of the world power, Babylon. Kings and kingdoms. Belshazzar was dancing on the edge of his grave, and he did not even realize it. And the mighty Babylonian kingdom was taken down. I like how in the text here, like one of the most significant events in human history, the transfer of world dominance from the Babylonians to the Persians, primarily the Medes and the Persians. It's a big event in all of human history. This significant change in events in human history is recorded in a very few simple words in the text. You know why? Because kings and kingdoms, as we said every week, kings and kingdoms come and go. Only his kingdom endures forever. That God is in sovereign control of all of human history. That is the primary theme of the book of Daniel. That God is in sovereign control of all of human history. So what do we learn from this text? Let me mention a few things. One, and then these have to do with the writing on the wall. One, remember our days are numbered. When Belshazzar threw his party, he had no idea that he was facing his final night. Not just as king, but he's facing his final night on earth. You see, his sin, his rebellion, led to his demise. It led to his downfall, which is how the cycle of sin works. Sin, left to itself, always ends this way. It always ends in death. It always ends in destruction. It always ends in damage. And that's why we are reminded repeatedly in Scripture to remember the brevity of our lives, to remember that our days are numbered, that our time on earth is momentary. It is temporary. The New Testament writer James calls the days that we are here on earth a vapor, that it disappears, that it is here for a moment and then it is gone, that death awaits each of us, that we are on God's timetable and not ours. And we are to be stewards of the time that God has gifted us. When we work through the book of Ephesians, remember that phrase that was in Ephesians, that we are to redeem the time, that we are to invest, right? That we are to take time and that we are to consider its weight and that we are to make the most of our time by following God. And so the question for us is, am I going to spend my time building my kingdom, building my sandcastles, or am I going to lay up treasures in heaven, to use the language of Jesus? Am I going to lay up treasures in heaven by living my life in light of eternity and not just the here and now? So Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar were kings of the most powerful kingdom on earth. But on history's timetable, they appear for a moment and then they disappear. The two most powerful kings of the most powerful kingdom on earth at that time, they're a glimpse. They are there for a moment and they are gone. Belshazzar is one chapter in a book that we call the Bible. That's his place in history. One chapter. The most powerful king of the most powerful kingdom on earth. You see, our reality is we will spend our life building a kingdom. The question for us is, which kingdom? Am I going to build my earthly kingdom, or am I going to build his eternal kingdom? Only one of those kingdoms is going to last, by the way. So be careful to which kingdom you give your allegiance. And I think that's important to repeat in an election cycle year. Be careful to which kingdom you give your allegiance. There's kingdoms that are vying for our attention right now. There's earthly kingdoms asking you to line up one way or the other, this, that, us, them. Be careful to which kingdom you give your allegiance. As followers of Jesus, our allegiance is to a spiritual kingdom, not an earthly kingdom. So we have to be very careful in these seasons where there's a lot of social media, a lot of emphasis, a lot of talk, a lot of Facebook posts. Be careful to which kingdom you give your allegiance. Like, I have to be honest with you, this week with some of the events happening in our country, I had to take a step back from social media because a lot of people that profess to be followers of Jesus have me questioning what kingdom they're aligned with. Are we aligned with an earthly kingdom or a spiritual kingdom? We serve one king, and his name is Jesus. Be careful to what kingdom we are giving our allegiance. All right, let's move on. I don't want to step on toes today. Mine either. Another thing to be reminded of from this text, there is a Belshazzar that is lurking in each of our hearts. Let's be honest. There's a Belshazzar that lurks in each of our hearts. And here's what I mean by that. We tend to be drawn to the glitz and the power of earthly kingdoms. We tend to be fascinated by the meaningless. We tend to chase the worthless. We covet what we do not have. We idolize what we do have. We place eternal weight on temporary stuff. We prioritize things that are found wanting on the scale of eternal significance. We function in our everyday life like Belshazzars. We prioritize comfort, we prioritize our stuff, we prioritize security, we prioritize achievements and status, and we give these earthly matters primary importance in our lives, while at the same time confessing with our lips that Jesus is our King. Functional Belshazzars. Living everyday life as if those things are the most important things, the ultimate things in our lives. We talk about this on the regular at City Church. How we tend to take the good and the gracious gifts of our God, our Creator God, our bodies, our talents, our spouses, our children, our influence, our accomplishments. We tend to take God's good and gracious gifts and we make them our idols, our small g gods. We use His gifts to feed our own desires. We function like Belshazzar. We're not throwing big parties with thousands of nobles to come and taking sacred vessels and giving a toast to false gods, but we live our everyday life as if created things are the most important things, just like he did. And here's the next idea from this text on why that is so dangerous for us. Because we also learn in this text that human idols are empty and powerless. Human idols are empty and powerless. So, Belshazzar's gods were made of gold and silver, iron, wood, and stone. Daniel says they're unable to hear, unable to see, unable to respond. Guess what? Belshazzar's gods could not prevent the one true God from showing up and disrupting the feast. Neither could Belshazzar's gods protect him from the Medes and the Persians that were literally lurking outside the city walls, ready to invade. But just like the gods and idols of Belshazzar, the idols that we pursue and cling to promise us great reward and fulfillment, but they leave us empty and unfulfilled. You see, if we take and make created things into idols and neglect the Creator, if we take created things and make them the most important things, the ultimate things in our lives, even if they are good things, if we make them the ultimate things, the good and gracious gifts of God, if we take those gifts and make them the most important things, we are just as foolish and just as blind as Belshazzar, dancing on the edge of the grave. You see, created things are not what we were made to live for. Do you hear that? Created things are not what we were made to live for. Created things, the good and gracious gifts of God, they're signs. They point us to the Creator. Let me tell you something super profound. Like you're going to walk away from City Church today like, man, that is so profound. The sign is not the thing. It's just pointing to the thing. You get that, right? So if you're driving from here to Chat and it's like you're going along the way and if you've seen 150 Ruby Falls signs, like come see Ruby Falls every 10 minutes, right? I think there's less now. Somebody must have put out a petition or something like take down some of those signs. It used to be like every 5 feet. Discover Ruby Falls signs. Now you would think I was a fool if I was driving from here and on the other side of Huntsville, I stopped at the very first Ruby Falls sign and I got out and took a picture, had Ash take a picture of me standing by the sign and be like, we made it. We're at Ruby Falls. Isn't this awesome? Check out Ruby Falls. Be like, dude, you're at the sign. You're not at Ruby Falls. That's the sign. You're not at Ruby Falls until you get the picture of, if you've ever been there, like the cave with the giant waterfall. By the way, how did that dude crawl like thousands of feet in a 3-foot hole and find a water? That dude needs a reward or something, right? The dude climbed a 3-foot hole. How many of you have been to Ruby Falls? Am I only talking to myself? A lot of you. Are y'all not impressed like I am by that? But when I get back in there and I see the waterfall in the cave, then take the picture like, oh, Devin went to Ruby Falls. You don't say that if I'm standing by the sign. I'm at Ruby Falls. Tag myself at Ruby Falls. Hashtag Ruby Falls. Be like, hashtag sign. The sign points to the thing, the real thing. The creation, the good and gracious gifts of God are pointing us to the thing, pointing us to the Creator. It is foolish and sad to look for what can't be found in something or someone that can't deliver it. It is foolish and sad to look for what can't be found in something or someone that can't deliver it. Your kids can't bring you ultimate fulfillment and satisfaction. Your job cannot give you meaning and purpose in life. Getting married is not going to bring you ultimate happiness. Having an awesome marriage is not what's going to bring you the deepest level of fulfillment and satisfaction in your life. These are good and gracious gifts of God, but they are not things that can bring us the true meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in life because they were not created for that purpose. I was reading this week in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you're familiar with Ecclesiastes, it's like King Solomon, the most powerful, wealthiest, king of his time, maybe of all time, had everything he ever wanted for at his fingertips. All the wine, women, wealth, like whatever W word you want to add to it, right? He had it all. And he's writing in the book of Ecclesiastes, and he makes this phrase, I've had all these things. And it is the equivalent of striving after the wind. I love that phrase. Striving after the wind. I had everything in life, and it's like me trying to chase down the wind. It can't bring fulfillment, meaning, purpose to me in life. You see, if we seek to find meaning, purpose, fulfillment, peace in things or people that are not created for that purpose, we are found wanting. And it is why we have to be reminded regularly of the gospel. It's why we have to be reminded in this story of this gospel truth. God continues to show us mercy, doesn't he? He continues to show and display his mercy. He continues to extend his mercy, extend his grace, extend his forgiveness to those who rebel against him, to those who turn from his gracious provisions. He continues to show mercy when we make it about us. He continues to show mercy when we prioritize the earthly over the heavenly. He continues to show mercy when we chase after false idols. He continues to show mercy when we are left empty, when we are left broken. He is the God of mercy. So praise be to God this morning that our sin can never outpace or outrun his mercy. He is faithful. And he continues to show his mercy again and again and again. When we turn created things into the ultimate things, when we turn good and gracious gifts into ultimate and most important things in our lives, he continues to show us mercy again and again and again. And that's why I want to leave this chapter with this final thought. Like part of understanding that continual display of mercy is that we should posture our hearts to live as people who are recipients of God's undeserved grace. Like we have to live with that posture in life, that we are recipients of undeserved grace, to live life with a grace lens. As you process this story, here's the question that I was kind of left asking myself this week as I was thinking through this. Like, who am I to be invited to feast at the king's table? Who am I to be invited to feast at the king's table? Who am I to be invited to sit at his banquet hall of grace? And I remembered from our David series. So remember the story in our David series? If you didn't, you can go back and watch the David series. But there was a story we talked about in the David series of the grandson of Saul. Remember this guy? That when the changing of the regime was announced, that his attendant that was caring for him, dropped him and he became crippled. Mephibosheth, one of those awesome other Bible names that nobody wanted to read during the David series because they were like, I can't pull off Mephibosheth, I'm out. And so, but David tracks down this guy, one of Saul's heirs, and calls for him down in the land of Lodebar. Remember that? Lodebar. It was like the lower income part of the kingdom. And he says, go get him from Lodebar and bring him. And Mephibosheth's all, that's a tongue twister. Mephibosheth is all freaked out. It's like, man, I'm a living heir. They didn't even know I existed. Now here I am. David's going to take me out. And David's like, no, come here. You're going to be one of my boys. You're going to sit at the king's table. You're not going to have to worry about food or provision. Matter of fact, I'm going to give you a piece of land, and I'm going to give people that can toil the land and work it for you, and you're never going to go for need or want again. Mephibosheth, he was sitting at the king's table, undeserved grace. And man, this has to be the posture of our hearts. You see, unlike the kingdom of Belshazzar, which was found wanting and faced God's judgment and was brought down by a sovereign God, there is a kingdom which God has established. And this kingdom is established in Jesus. You see, the Son of God humbled himself and entered into his own creation. And he possessed none of the outward glitz and glamour that fascinates us. And he possessed none of the glitz and glamour for which we tend to clamor. He had very few possessions and only a handful of friends. Jesus had no outward beauty, Isaiah the prophet says. He had no splendor. He was not a conqueror. He was a carpenter. He did not possess the riches to throw large keg parties. He was a humble servant, and his kingdom was not of this world. Yet, when Jesus' life was weighed in God's balances, it was not found to be wanting. It was found to be perfect and complete. It was found to be able to satisfy fully the demands of God, not just for himself, but for all of us who come to God through him. You see, his great banquet awaits us in the future at the end of time, when not just 1,000 lords, but when millions upon millions upon millions who have been washed by the blood of the Lamb will gather and confess our allegiance to our King. And on that day, there will be no interruptions. There will be no interruptions at his banquet. God's sovereign rule will be established in heaven and on earth forever and ever. All enemies will be vanquished, and Jesus will rule and reign. Our days are numbered. There's a Belshazzar lurking in the corners of my heart. My idols, my earthly idols, are worthless and powerless. But the good news of the gospel is that there is a God who continues to show us his mercy. There is a God who lavishes his grace upon us even in our most rebellious moments. And there is a God who will never give up on us. You see, the severed hand that pronounced judgment on Belshazzar is a foreshadow. It is a foreshadow of a nail-pierced hand, of the one who would take the wrath and judgment of God upon himself, so that we might be brought into his family and sit at his table in his eternal kingdom. Praise be to God that Jesus is the greater King. Let's bow our heads for prayer.